comes to net zero versus carbon neutral, it's really important to define the key language and the key differences between the two of them, because quite often carbon neutral might be used, and it's been around a lot longer in the past 10 years, but has some substantial differences to net zero. So in terms of carbon neutral, the idea would be that you measure your footprint, and as we saw in the very neat example previously, you end up with 100 tonnes of emissions. Now, once you've measured your carbon footprint, you then want to neutralise it, and you would buy offsets equal to that 100 tonnes of either offsets or what we call carbon credits. These are schemes where it is drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere and therefore is, in theory, neutralising your impact. The challenge with carbon neutral is that sometimes it only includes carbon dioxide, and sometimes it has no requirement for reduction actions either, and therefore it is seen as sometimes a business as usual thing where you can just offset and essentially throw money at the problem to make it go away. That is not necessarily a bad thing to do, and I think a carbon neutral status is quite a good place to start on your journey, where you might buy those offsets as the first action you do while you work out what you're doing. However, it is increasingly under scrutiny for these reasons, and we'll look at some definitions of why in the next slide. The benefit of carbon neutral is that it is certified, so PAS 2060 is a really good standard that does have requirements for things like reduction and does include more than just carbon dioxide in terms of its requirements. And it's important to think back to the previous videos why only including carbon dioxide is quite dangerous. It might be avoiding things like methane or nitrous oxide or fluorinated gases as part of that carbon footprint, which are producing quite a lot of emissions. And therefore, it's a standard that I would always be quite cautious of looking at for other businesses, and always trying to understand how they're defining it and what standards they're aligning to. That scrutiny is coming mostly from the European Union, where they are banning some unverified claims in 2026. So you can see here there's an article in The Guardian from the 17th of January where they talk through this, and I think it is that lack of substantiation and lack of verification that is really the concern that's driving this. So again, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be doing as long as you're doing it in the right way and for the right reasons. So any claims are relying heavily on offsetting, the EU is starting to crack down on, and these might be phrases like climate positive, carbon neutral, or any terms really that lack evidence and lack that substantiation. Terms like environmentally friendly, natural, biodegradable, climate neutral, eco-friendly, eco. These phrases, if they're not being substantiated correctly and not being transparently explained as to how they're being applied, are going to be under increasing pressure as of 2026. So just be wary here of the things that you're claiming or putting out there and going, actually, have you done the maths on that? How are you quantifying these impacts? Or are you just saying it because you think it's true? Well, actually, let's make sure that you're demonstrating how it is true alongside that. This is where net zero really does come into a bit of difference, where it requires action reduction. So if you have that 100 tonnes of emissions that we've measured, you would then need to reduce it by 90% in order to get to that carbon neutral status. That is by 2045, or in some cases 2050, and therefore you do have time in order to do that. The Science Based Targets initiative is what's driving a lot of this, and this is coming through corporate supply chains, which we'll look at in the next video of the impacts of this on industry. But that Science Based Targets initiative requires us to halve our emissions by 2030, and that is in line with the science of what is needed to keep within a 1.5 degrees of warming at a global level, is a halving of emissions. Again, that halving, or that 90%, might feel like really big numbers, but we'll look at some examples later of how it's quite small. For example, an LED light bulb is a 90% reduction in your electricity usage and therefore can reduce things quite quickly. The key thing with net zero is that really it includes all greenhouse gases, and most standards will include all those ones that we mentioned earlier, and mean that it's a much fuller picture of your carbon footprint, and it requires action. It requires you to report and reduce year on year on what you're doing, and therefore allows you that decarbonisation pathway through action that is actually going to make a meaningful difference and isn't just relying on offsetting. It also includes those things like direct sources and indirect sources. So it is looking at your supply chain, as we saw in that scope 1, 2, 3 language that is aligned around net zero, to ensure that you're doing everything within your organisation's power to reduce those emissions. However, there are some limits on what are going to be required there in terms of reporting, so don't worry too much. There are easier things that are being required upfront in the short term. The main thing here to remember, and what I would focus on, is that 50% reduction by 2030 and how we achieve that. And we're going to look at some examples of this in the next section. Something else that I forgot to mention is that baseline measurement year is that you would set a year such as 2024, or maybe you go back to 2019 and measure your footprint with the historical data then, and that's going to define what year you're comparing against and where that 90% or where that 50% is coming from and against what. So if your footprint was 100 tonnes in 2019, it might be through some changes you've made in your business, such as LEDs, such as moving office to a more efficient one. That might already be things that you can start claiming on your journey because you're already making these changes without measuring it and without realising. So there are ways to count that and backdate it and make sure that that's being captured as part of your journey. In this section, I'm going to look at a bit more around taking action and what that really looks like.